The young man saw a man in a wheelchair trying to climb the trail alone. After an entire day helping him, something unexpected happened the next day, and he couldn't believe it when they opened the door. Jason was weaving through traffic, his legs pumping furiously on his worn-out bike pedals. Horns blared as he slipped past cars, the box strapped to his back shifting with each movement. He glanced at the city clock tower. 7:32 p.m. He was late again. His last delivery of the day. He couldn't afford to miss it. Not today. He skidded to a stop outside the address, double-checking his delivery app. Apartment 12B. He took a deep breath, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and hurried inside. After a few knocks, the door opened, revealing a woman in her mid-30s, her eyebrows arched in impatience. "Food delivery?" Jason said, trying to catch his breath. "About time," the woman huffed, taking the package. She handed Jason a few crumpled bills and shut the door before he could say anything else. He stared at the closed door for a second before shoving the cash into his pocket. It wasn't much, but every cent counted. Jason made his way back to his bike and rode home. The streets were starting to empty out, but the fatigue from the day had settled in his bones. When he finally reached home, he could see the dull yellow light from their kitchen window. He leaned his bike against the wall and paused, trying to shake off the day's exhaustion before going inside. The small kitchen was cluttered, dishes piled in the sink, the table covered in papers. His father sat hunched at the table, staring blankly at another stack of rejection letters. Jason watched for a moment, noticing his father's face. It was etched with weariness, lines deeper than Jason remembered. "How'd it go today?" Jason asked, hoping for a different answer than the usual. His father looked up, his eyes tired. "Same old story. Nobody's hiring." Jason nodded, though the heaviness in his chest grew. He set down his delivery box, removing his faded uniform shirt and hanging it over a chair. He noticed an envelope on the kitchen table, one he'd been avoiding for days. The landlord's latest eviction notice. Jason sighed and sat down across from his father, picking up the envelope. "We need more time," Jason murmured, staring at the landlord's bolded warnings. "I'll talk to him tomorrow. Maybe he'll give us another week." His father shook his head. "We've been asking for more time for months now, son. Sooner or later, we're going to run out of chances." Jason didn't reply. He looked around their tiny kitchen, the paint peeling on the walls, the single flickering bulb above them. He knew his father was right. They were running out of chances. The pressure of their situation was like a knot in his stomach, twisting tighter every day. That night, Jason lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling. The soft murmurs of his father, sobbing quietly from the next room, seeped through the thin walls. He closed his eyes, trying to block it out, but it was impossible. It hurt to hear it, the sound of his father breaking, trying to hide his pain. Jason turned to his side and glanced at a small box beside his bed. It was labeled Cachoeiras Azuis, the name written in his own shaky handwriting. He opened it, counting the small bills and coins inside. He had been saving for months. It wasn't much, but maybe enough for one day at the Waterfalls. One day away from everything. Jason woke before dawn. The city was still dark, the hum of early morning distant in the background. He pushed himself up, his body feeling heavy from yesterday's deliveries. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the box labeled Cachoeiras Azuis. Today, he needed to count every cent. Maybe, just maybe, he finally had enough. Jason opened the box, emptying the coins and crumpled bills onto the bed. He began to count, hands moving quickly, eyes fixed on the small pile. As he reached the final coin, he paused, holding his breath. The total was enough, just barely. He could afford the bus, the entry fee, maybe a cheap snack. He took a deep breath, staring at the pile of coins. The thought of visiting the waterfalls was a small light amidst all the darkness. He felt his chest tighten as he thought about what this meant. His one chance to step away from the weight of everything, to forget just for a day. As Jason was lost in thought, he heard a soft shuffle from the other room. He quickly swept the coins back into the box, setting it under his bed. His father appeared in the doorway, his face lined with exhaustion. He was wearing the same clothes from yesterday, his shirt wrinkled. "You're up early," his father said, his voice gravelly. He nodded towards Jason's bed, noticing the empty box. "Counting the savings?" Jason forced a smile. "Yeah, just seeing how close we are. Maybe we can make it work." His father gave a tired nod, stepping into the kitchen. Jason could hear him clattering around, filling the kettle with water. Jason followed, watching as his father poured 2 mugs of hot water. No tea, no coffee, just hot water. They sat down at the small table, the landlord's letter still lying there like a dark cloud. "We're going to have to talk to him today," his father said quietly, his eyes fixed on the letter. "We don't have enough to keep stalling." Jason nodded. He knew what his father was saying, and it made the decision in his heart even harder. He wanted to take the money, to escape for one day, but they needed every cent for rent. The knot in his stomach twisted tighter. "Let me handle it," Jason said, trying to sound confident. "I'll figure something out." His father gave him a tired smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "You always do, son." Jason left the apartment a few minutes later, his backpack on his shoulders and his delivery uniform neatly tucked inside. He climbed onto his bike and began to pedal, the cold morning air biting at his face. He pushed himself hard, trying to drown out the thoughts in his head, the landlord, his father, the bills stacking up. The knot in his stomach was a constant presence, but he kept his eyes ahead, focused. The hours blurred together, delivery after delivery. He moved through the streets, weaving between cars, past strangers, the sun rising above the buildings. He counted his tips at each stop, pocketing the small coins, adding them mentally to his savings for the day. Every coin mattered. By noon, Jason was drenched in sweat, his body aching. He stopped at a small park, taking a seat on a bench, his bike propped next to him. He opened his backpack, pulling out the small sandwich he'd packed, 2 slices of bread with a thin layer of peanut butter. He took a bite, looking at the people passing by. Families with children, teenagers laughing. They looked carefree. He wondered what that felt like. Jason finished his sandwich, brushing the crumbs off his lap. He took out his phone, looking at the screen. A notification from the bank flashed. Overdue payment. He closed the message, shoving the phone back into his pocket. His chest felt heavy, the knot tightening further. He needed to make a decision. The money for rent, or the trip to Cachoeiras Azuis. His dream, or their survival. He closed his eyes, trying to push the thoughts away, but they were relentless. That evening, Jason returned home, his legs aching from the long day. He climbed the stairs slowly, feeling the weight of every step. He could hear the television from inside the apartment, the faint sound of the news. He pushed the door open and found his father on the couch, staring at the screen. "Hey," Jason said, dropping his backpack onto the floor. His father looked over, his eyes tired. "Long day?" "Yeah." Jason walked over to the kitchen, grabbing the last of the bread from the cabinet. He cut it in half, making 2 small sandwiches. He brought them over to the couch, handing one to his father. They ate in silence, the news playing in the background, talking about politics, weather, things that felt distant and irrelevant. His father put the plate down, turning towards Jason. "You ever think about getting out of here?" he asked, his voice quiet. "Leaving this place, doing something different?" Jason looked at him, surprised. "I mean, yeah, I guess," he said. "But it's not that simple." His father sighed, nodding. I know, I hate seeing you work so hard just to barely get by. You deserve better than this." Jason swallowed, his throat tight. He looked at his father, seeing the sadness in his eyes. The guilt weighed on him heavily. He was supposed to be the one helping, making things better. That night, Jason lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. His father's words echoed in his mind. He reached down, pulling the box labeled Cachoeiras Azuis from under his bed. He opened it, looking at the coins and bills inside. It wasn't much, but it was something. He had made his decision. Tomorrow, he was going to the waterfalls. Jason woke before the sun again, the dim light of dawn just starting to creep through his window. His decision was final. Today, he was going to the Cachoeiras Azuis. He moved slowly, trying not to make noise, not wanting to wake his father. He packed a few things into his backpack, his old water bottle, a small towel, and the box of savings. He tiptoed into the kitchen and scribbled a quick note for his father. "Gone for a bit, don't worry. I'll be back soon." He left it on the table and slipped out the front door. As he made his way down the stairs, Jason felt an odd sense of guilt, but he pushed it away. He needed this day for himself. Jason arrived at the bus stop, standing in the cold air. He looked down at his phone, checking the schedule. The bus to the waterfalls would arrive soon. He dug into his pocket, pulling out a handful of coins, enough to cover the ride there and back. The bus arrived, the brakes squeaking as it stopped in front of him. Jason climbed in, handing the coins to the driver and moving to an empty seat near the back. He leaned his head against the window, watching the city fade away as the bus moved farther out. Slowly, the tall buildings gave way to small houses, then to nothing but fields and trees. He could feel some of the tension leaving his shoulders as they drove. The knot in his stomach eased a little. It felt good to get away, even if just for a few hours. The bus finally stopped at the base of the trail leading to the Cachoeiras Azuis. Jason stepped off, looking up at the path ahead. The sun was rising now, the sky a bright, cloudless blue. He took a deep breath and started walking, feeling lighter with each step. He could hear the distant roar of the waterfall, calling to him. The trail was rocky, but the air was fresh and cool. Jason walked steadily, enjoying the sound of the birds, the rustle of the wind in the trees. He was finally here. No more deliveries, no more bills, no more landlord for today. Just the waterfall and him. As he rounded a bend, Jason's steps faltered. Up ahead, there was a man in a wheelchair, struggling to move up the trail. The man was bald, his arms straining against the wheels, his face twisted in concentration. Jason paused, watching the man for a moment, unsure of what to do. This was supposed to be his day. He had come here to get away from his responsibilities, not to add another one. But he couldn't just leave the guy there. The man looked like he needed help, and Jason knew that ignoring him would weigh on his conscience for the rest of the day. Jason approached, clearing his throat. "Hey, need a hand?" The man looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly before he nodded, breathing heavily. Yeah, that would be great. This trail is tougher than I thought." Jason moved behind the wheelchair, gripping the handles. "All right, I got you. Where you headed?" "Just trying to get to the waterfall," the man said, his voice filled with determination. "I've never seen it before." Jason nodded, pushing the wheelchair forward. It wasn't easy. The path was full of rocks and uneven ground, and the wheelchair kept jostling as they moved. The man in the chair tried to help, using his arms to pull at the wheels, but it was slow going. They hit a particularly rough patch, and the chair lurched to the side, nearly tipping over. Jason grunted, using all his strength to keep it upright. His heart pounded, and he took a step back, catching his breath. Maybe this was a bad idea," Jason said, looking down at the man. The man shook his head, his eyes fierce. "No, I need to see this. I don't care how long it takes." Jason studied him for a moment, then nodded. He tightened his grip on the handles. All right then. Let's do it. They kept going inch by inch. Jason's muscles were starting to burn, his arms aching as he pushed. The trail seemed to stretch on forever, winding up and around, and he could barely hear the waterfall now. He glanced down at the man who was staring straight ahead, his face set in determination. What's your name? Jason asked, trying to distract himself from the pain in his arms. Paul, the man replied. He looked up at Jason, sweat dripping from his brow. And you? Jason. Nice to meet you, Jason. I appreciate this. I really do. Jason forced a smile, though his arms were trembling. Yeah, well, don't thank me yet. We still got a ways to go. As they continued, Jason could feel his exhaustion growing. His legs were tired from all the deliveries, his arms were burning, and the chair kept catching on rocks, jerking backward. A group of hikers passed by them, glancing curiously at Jason and Paul. One of them, a middle-aged man, stopped, shaking his head. Are you sure you guys should be doing this? Looks dangerous, the man said. Jason forced a tight smile. We're fine, thanks. The man shrugged and moved on, but his words lingered. Was this too much? Was he being reckless? Jason looked at Paul, who was staring ahead, unblinking. He remembered his father's face last night, the way he had talked about getting out of this place. Jason understood the need to do something, anything, to escape. He took a deep breath and kept pushing. They reached a bend in the trail where it suddenly became steeper. Jason paused, his arms trembling. The trail ahead looked rougher, narrower. He looked at Paul, who nodded. We're close, right? Paul asked, his voice hopeful. Yeah, we're close, Jason said, though he wasn't sure. He could hear the water again, louder now, rushing in the distance. He took another deep breath and pushed forward, using all his strength to get up the steep incline. The wheelchair caught on a rock, jerking to the side. Jason's heart skipped a beat as he struggled to keep it upright. Paul held onto the armrests, his knuckles white. Jason gritted his teeth, pulling the chair back onto the path, sweat dripping from his forehead. Maybe we walk from here, Jason suggested, looking down at Paul. The incline was too steep, too dangerous. Paul looked at the ground, then at Jason. He hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, all right. Jason moved around, helping Paul out of the chair. He slipped Paul's arm over his shoulder, supporting his weight. He folded up the wheelchair with his other hand, balancing it awkwardly. They began to move slowly, step by step, the incline making it hard for Jason to find his footing. He could feel Paul leaning heavily against him, his breaths coming in short gasps. Almost there, man, Jason said, trying to keep his voice steady. We're gonna make it. The sound of the waterfall was louder now, the roar filling the air. Jason could feel the mist, cool against his skin. He glanced at Paul, who was staring ahead, his eyes wide. They rounded the final bend, and there it was, the Cachoeiras Azuis, the water rushing down, crashing into the pool below. Jason stopped, letting out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Paul stared, his eyes glistening with tears. I never thought I'd get here, Paul whispered, his voice cracking. He looked at Jason, his eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you. Jason nodded, his own exhaustion forgotten for a moment. He helped Paul sit on a rock near the edge, unfolding the wheelchair beside him. Jason looked at the waterfall, the mist cooling his face, the roar drowning out every other sound. For the first time in a long time, he felt free. Jason and Paul sat by the edge of the waterfall, catching their breath. The roar of the water was all around them, filling the air. Jason wiped the sweat from his forehead, looking over at Paul, who seemed lost in the view, his eyes glistening in awe. Beautiful, huh? Jason said, his voice loud enough to be heard over the rush. Paul nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. Yeah, I've seen pictures, but it's different being here. Jason smiled too, but his muscles were aching, his arms shaking from the climb. He looked back down the trail, the path that led them here. It had been harder than he expected, and he knew they still had to get back down. The thought made his stomach tighten, but he didn't say anything. Not yet. Paul deserved this moment. After a while, Paul shifted, wincing as he moved. He looked at Jason, his smile fading just slightly. "I hate to ask, but could we get closer to the water?" Jason hesitated. The edge was steep, rocks jutting out at odd angles, the mist making everything slippery. He looked at Paul's hopeful expression, and for a moment he wanted to say no. But then, he remembered the look on his father's face the previous night, the way he'd talked about wanting to do something different, to leave behind the struggle, even for a moment. "Yeah, all right," Jason said, nodding. He got to his feet, brushing off his pants. He moved over to Paul, helping him up. "You sure you're up for it?" Paul looked at the water, then back at Jason, determination in his eyes. "Yeah, I've come this far, haven't I?" Jason smiled, slipping Paul's arm over his shoulder again. He grabbed the wheelchair, folding it up as best he could, and they began to move slowly, step by step. The ground was slippery, and Jason had to focus on each step, making sure neither of them fell. The closer they got, the colder the air became. The mist was thick, clinging to their clothes, making it hard to see. The roar of the water was deafening now, drowning out everything else. Jason could feel Paul leaning heavily on him, his breaths coming out in short bursts. "We're almost there," Jason shouted over the noise, his voice straining. Paul nodded, his face pale but his eyes still determined. They reached the edge, the spray from the waterfall soaking them completely. Jason helped Paul sit down on a flat rock, positioning him so he could see the water. Jason set the wheelchair beside them, then sat down heavily, his body aching. Paul looked out at the waterfall, his face softening. He reached out, letting the mist hit his hand, his eyes closing. Jason watched him, the knot in his stomach loosening just a little. It felt good to see Paul happy, to know that he'd helped make this moment possible. After a few minutes, Paul opened his eyes, looking over at Jason. "You know, the doctor said I'd never do this kind of thing again," he said, his voice almost lost in the roar of the water. "They told me I'd be stuck at home, that I'd have to get used to a different kind of life." Jason frowned, glancing at Paul. "And you just decided not to listen to them?" Paul laughed, a short, breathy sound. "Something like that. I wasn't ready to give up, not yet." He looked back at the water, his expression thoughtful. "It's funny. I thought I was coming here just to prove something to myself, but it's more than that. It's about feeling alive again." Jason nodded, though he couldn't fully understand what Paul was going through. He felt a pang of guilt, realizing how close he'd come to walking away earlier, to not helping Paul at all. He hadn't known what this meant to Paul. Not really. Now, seeing the look on Paul's face, he was glad he'd stayed. After a while, Paul shifted, wincing again. He looked at Jason, his expression apologetic. "We should probably head back, huh?" Jason sighed, looking back at the trail. The way down would be even harder. His arms were already sore, his legs shaky. But they had to do it. He couldn't just leave Paul here. "Yeah, I guess so," Jason said, pushing himself to his feet. He helped Paul up, steadying him before unfolding the wheelchair again. "Let's take it slow. We've got all the time we need." They started back down the trail, Jason pushing the wheelchair carefully. The rocks were slippery, and the narrow path made it difficult to keep the chair steady. Jason could feel his muscles burning, each step taking more effort than the last. They came to a steep section, and Jason paused, taking a deep breath. His arms were shaking, and he knew he couldn't keep this up much longer. He looked at Paul, who was staring straight ahead, his face set in determination. "We might need to take a break soon," Jason said, his voice strained. Paul nodded, though his eyes were filled with concern. "Are you all right?" "I mean, I know this is a lot." Jason forced a smile. "I'm fine. Just a bit tired." They moved on, inch by inch, Jason focusing on each step, making sure not to lose his grip on the wheelchair. The path was narrow, the rocks jutting out at awkward angles. Jason's foot slipped, and he stumbled, his heart lurching. He caught himself, but just barely. Paul grabbed the armrests of the wheelchair, his face going pale. "Maybe we should stop for a bit," Paul said, his voice shaky. Jason nodded, his chest heaving. He helped Paul out of the chair, setting him down on a flat rock by the side of the trail. Jason sank down beside him, his arms trembling, his body aching. He closed his eyes, trying to catch his breath. Paul looked at him, concern etched across his face. "I'm sorry, man. I didn't mean for this to be so hard on you." Jason shook his head, forcing a smile. "Nah, don't worry about it. I wanted to help." Paul looked down at his hands, his expression pained. I hate being a burden, you know? I hate feeling like I can't do anything on my own." Jason was quiet for a moment, then looked at Paul. "You're not a burden, I mean it. You're just trying to live your life, same as anyone else." Paul nodded, though he didn't look convinced. Jason could see the frustration in his eyes, the anger at his own body for not cooperating. It was a feeling Jason understood in a different way. He thought about his father, the struggle to make ends meet, the way it felt like no matter how hard he worked, it was never enough. "We're gonna make it back," Jason said, his voice firm. "One step at a time, all right?" Paul looked at him, then nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "All right. One step at a time." Jason got to his feet, helping Paul back into the wheelchair. They moved slowly, Jason focusing on each step, each rock, making sure they didn't lose their footing. The sun was starting to set, the sky turning a soft orange. They still had a long way to go, but Jason didn't let himself think about that. He focused on the present, on each moment, on getting Paul down safely. As they reached a bend in the trail, Jason heard voices, other hikers making their way down. A group of people appeared, their faces lighting up when they saw Jason and Paul. "Hey, do you guys need help?" one of them called out, a young woman with a kind smile. Jason paused, then nodded, relief washing over him. "Yeah, actually, that'd be great." The group moved towards them, a couple of them taking the wheelchair handles from Jason, allowing him to step back, his arms finally getting a break. The young woman smiled at Paul, giving him a reassuring nod. "We'll get you down. No problem," she said. Jason followed behind as they made their way down, his body aching, but his heart feeling lighter. He watched as Paul talked with the hikers, his face relaxing, the tension easing. Jason knew they still had a long way to go, but for the first time, he felt like they weren't alone. They reached the bottom of the trail as the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky turning dark. Jason looked at Paul, who was smiling, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Jason," Paul said quietly. "I couldn't have done this without you." Jason nodded, a tired smile on his face. "Glad I could help, man." And as they stood there, the waterfall a distant roar behind them, Jason felt something shift inside him. It wasn't just about escaping anymore. It was about finding moments like this, moments where he could make a difference, even if just for one person. Jason and Paul made it to the parking area at the base of the trail. The hikers who had helped them down waved goodbye, heading off to their cars. Jason and Paul stood there for a moment, watching as the vehicles pulled away, leaving them in the growing dark. "Looks like it's just us again," Paul said, smiling weakly. Jason chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, I guess it is." He looked around, spotting a bench near the edge of the lot. "Come on, let's sit for a minute." He pushed Paul over to the bench and then sat down next to him, both of them catching their breath. The air was cooler now, and Jason shivered slightly, feeling the sweat on his skin starting to chill. He looked over at Paul, who was staring up at the darkening sky. "You know, I wasn't sure we'd make it," Paul said after a moment, his voice quiet. Jason glanced at him. "Me neither," he admitted. "But we did." Paul nodded, his eyes distant. "I used to think about moments like this a lot, back when I was in the hospital. I'd imagine myself getting out, doing all the things they said I wouldn't be able to do." He looked at Jason, his expression serious. I think today might have been the first time I actually believed it." Jason didn't know what to say to that. He just nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He could feel the exhaustion weighing on him, the ache in his muscles from the climb. But hearing Paul say that made it all feel worth it. "Well, I'm glad I could help," Jason said, his voice rough. Paul smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "You did more than help, Jason. You made this possible." They sat in silence for a while, the night settling around them. The roar of the waterfall was still faintly audible in the distance, a steady reminder of what they had accomplished that day. Jason felt a strange sense of peace, a quietness that he hadn't felt in a long time. Eventually, Paul shifted, wincing as he moved. "We should probably get going, it's getting late." Jason nodded, standing up and grabbing the handles of the wheelchair. "Yeah, let's get you home." They made their way to the bus stop, Jason pushing Paul carefully over the uneven pavement. The bus was late, and they stood there for a long time, neither of them saying much. The exhaustion was catching up to Jason, his body aching, his eyes heavy. When the bus finally arrived, Jason helped Paul up the steps, folding the wheelchair and carrying it on board. They found seats near the back, and Jason leaned his head against the window, closing his eyes for a moment. The hum of the bus engine was almost soothing, lulling him into a half-sleep. "Hey, Jason," Paul said, his voice cutting through the haze of exhaustion. Jason opened his eyes, turning towards Paul. "Yeah? I never asked. Why'd you do it? I mean, you could have just kept going, had your day at the waterfalls, but you stopped to help me. Why?" Jason blinked, surprised by the question. He hadn't really thought about it before. He looked at Paul, seeing the genuine curiosity in his eyes, and shrugged. "I guess. I just saw you there, struggling, and I couldn't walk away," he said, his voice low. "I know what it's like to feel like you're on your own, like no one cares enough to help." Paul was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, I get that." They lapsed into silence again, the bus rumbling along the dark road. Jason closed his eyes, trying to rest, but Paul's question lingered in his mind. Why had he done it? Maybe it was because he knew how it felt to be stuck, to feel like you were fighting a losing battle. Maybe he just didn't want someone else to feel that way. When the bus finally pulled into the city, Jason helped Paul off, unfolding the wheelchair and guiding him down the ramp. The streets were quieter now, the city settling into its nighttime rhythm. Jason looked around, feeling the familiar weight of the city pressing down on him again. "Where do you live?" Jason asked, pushing Paul along the sidewalk. "Not far from here," Paul said, pointing down the street. "Just a couple of blocks that way." Jason nodded, turning in the direction Paul had indicated. They moved slowly, the streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement. The neighborhood was run down, with boarded-up windows and graffiti covering the walls. Jason recognized the feeling of the place, the same sense of struggle that hung over his own home. They reached Paul's building, an old apartment complex with cracked steps and peeling paint. Jason helped Paul up the steps, carrying the wheelchair behind him. Paul fished a key out of his pocket, unlocking the front door and pushing it open. "Thanks, Jason," Paul said, turning to face him. "I don't think I can ever repay you for today." Jason shook his head, smiling tiredly. "You don't need to. I'm just glad I could help." Paul nodded, his eyes glistening. "If you ever need anything at all, you know where to find me." Jason gave him a nod, then turned to leave, his body aching with exhaustion. He made his way down the steps, back out onto the empty street. The walk home felt longer than usual, his feet dragging, his muscles heavy. But there was a lightness in his chest, a sense of accomplishment that kept him going. When Jason finally got home, the apartment was dark. He pushed the door open quietly, not wanting to wake his father. He slipped inside, dropping his bag onto the floor and moving into his room. He lay down on his bed, his body sinking into the worn mattress. He closed his eyes, letting out a long breath. Today had been different. It hadn't been about the bills, the rent, the constant struggle. It had been about something else, something bigger. And for the first time in a long time, Jason felt like maybe, just maybe, things could change. Jason woke up to the sound of the front door creaking open. His eyes felt heavy, but he managed to turn his head towards the door. His father was standing there, already dressed in his worn-out shirt and jeans. Jason could tell by the tired lines on his father's face that he had another long day ahead. Jason rubbed his eyes and pushed himself out of bed, his body still sore from the day before. "Morning, Dad," Jason mumbled, stretching his arms above his head. "Morning, son." His father looked over at him, a small smile tugging at his lips. "You came in late last night. Everything all right?" Jason nodded, yawning. "Yeah, just, got caught up in something." He didn't elaborate, and his father didn't ask. They both had their secrets, little burdens they kept from each other to avoid adding more weight. Jason looked at the clock. It was early, but he couldn't go back to sleep now, not when his father was already moving. He took a quick shower, the cold water waking him up, then put on his faded uniform. He heard the clatter of cups in the kitchen and walked in to see his father setting out 2 mugs of hot water. They sat down at the table, the silence between them heavy but comfortable. Jason stared at the steaming mug in front of him, feeling the ache in his muscles, the sting of exhaustion in his bones. But there was something else there, too, a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. "You got anything special today?" his father asked, breaking the silence. Jason shook his head. "Nah, just the usual deliveries." His father nodded, taking a sip of his hot water. He hesitated for a moment, then looked at Jason. "Listen, about the landlord. I know we're cutting it close again. I'm going to see if I can find something today. Anything. I don't want you carrying this burden alone." Jason looked at his father, seeing the determination in his eyes, and nodded. "I know, Dad. We'll figure it out." His father gave him a tired smile, then stood up, grabbing his old jacket. "All right then, I'll see you tonight." Jason watched him leave, the door clicking shut behind him. He sighed, rubbing his eyes, trying to shake off the exhaustion. He needed to get out there too, make as many deliveries as he could. The rent was due soon, and they were still short. But before he left, he took a moment to sit down on his bed and open the small box labeled Cachoeiras Azuis. The money inside was almost gone now. He had used most of it for the trip yesterday, but he didn't regret it. Not after seeing the look on Paul's face, the way his eyes had lit up at the waterfall. Jason stood up, grabbing his bag and heading out the door. He hopped on his bike, the familiar weight of his delivery box strapped to his back, and started pedaling. The streets were starting to come alive, people moving in and out of shops, cars honking in the distance. He moved through it all, focusing on the deliveries, one after the other. By noon, Jason had made a few bucks in tips, nothing substantial, but enough to add to the rent money. He stopped at a small park, sitting down on a bench to catch his breath. He pulled out the small sandwich he had packed, taking a bite and looking around at the people passing by. He saw kids running, couples walking hand in hand, people who didn't seem weighed down by the kind of worries he had. He was lost in thought when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, frowning at the unfamiliar number. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello?" "Hey, Jason, it's Paul," Jason sat up, surprised. "Paul, hey, what's up?" There was a pause, and Jason could hear the noise of traffic on the other end. "Listen, I know this might be a lot to ask, but could you meet me at the same place as yesterday? The base of the Cachoeiras Azuis Trail?" Jason blinked, glancing at his watch. "Today?" "Yeah, I know it's short notice, but there's something I need to do. I can't do it alone." Jason frowned, feeling the exhaustion in his body, the ache in his arms. The idea of going back up that trail today felt impossible. But he heard the urgency in Paul's voice, the same determination that had been there yesterday. "All right," Jason said, sighing. "I'll be there." "Thanks, Jason. I owe you one." Jason hung up, putting his phone back in his pocket. He looked at his bike, then at the busy street ahead. He had deliveries to make, rent to think about, a million things weighing him down. But he also remembered the look on Paul's face yesterday, the hope that had been there. Jason stood up, getting back on his bike. He turned in the direction of the bus stop, his legs moving almost on autopilot. He knew he should be focusing on his own problems, but something inside him couldn't say no to Paul. Not after what they'd been through together. The bus ride was quiet, the familiar rumble of the engine almost lulling him to sleep. Jason leaned his head against the window, closing his eyes for a moment. He could still feel the exhaustion in his body, but he pushed it away, focusing on what lay ahead. When the bus pulled up to the trailhead, Jason stepped off, looking around. He saw Paul waiting near the entrance, his wheelchair parked next to him. Paul looked up, smiling when he saw Jason. "You made it," Paul said, relief in his voice. Jason nodded, walking over. "Yeah, I made it. What's going on, Paul?" Paul looked at the trail, then back at Jason. "Yesterday I realized something. I need to do more than just see the waterfall. I need to feel it. I want to get in the water." Jason's eyes widened. "In the water? Paul, that's dangerous." Paul nodded, his face serious. "I know, but it's something I have to do. I can't explain it, Jason. I need to feel alive again. Yesterday was a start, but this would mean everything to me." Jason stared at Paul, seeing the determination in his eyes. He knew what Paul meant in a way. He knew what it was like to want more, to need to break out of the chains that held you down. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "All right, but we're doing this carefully. No risks, all right?" Paul smiled, his eyes brightening. "Deal." Jason grabbed the handles of the wheelchair, pushing Paul up the familiar trail. The path was just as rough as before, and Jason could feel his muscles protesting, his arms already tired from the day's work. But he kept going, focusing on each step, on keeping Paul safe. They reached the narrow section of the trail, and Jason paused, looking at Paul. "You sure about this?" Paul nodded, determination etched across his face. "I'm sure." Jason helped Paul out of the wheelchair, slipping his arm over his shoulder. He folded the wheelchair and carried it in his other hand, inching their way along the narrow path. The rocks were slippery, the mist from the waterfall making it hard to see. Jason could feel his heart pounding, each step feeling like a risk. "Almost there," Jason said, his voice strained. Paul nodded, his face set in concentration. They moved slowly, step by step, until they finally reached the edge. The waterfall roared in front of them, the mist thick in the air, the pool below shimmering in the sunlight. Jason set the wheelchair down, helping Paul sit on a flat rock by the edge. Paul looked at the water, his eyes wide, his breath coming in short gasps. "You ready?" Jason asked, his voice soft. Paul looked at him, tears glistening in his eyes. "Yeah, I'm ready." Jason helped Paul into the water, the cold hitting them both immediately. Paul gasped, his eyes widening, and Jason held onto him tightly, making sure he didn't slip. The water was up to their waists, the current strong, but Jason kept his grip firm. Paul looked up at the waterfall, his face breaking into a smile, a real, genuine smile. He reached out, letting the water splash over his hands, his laughter echoing above the roar of the falls. "I did it," Paul whispered, his voice filled with wonder. "I actually did it." Jason nodded, his own smile tugging at his lips. He could feel the cold, the ache in his muscles, but none of it mattered. This moment, seeing Paul like this, it made everything worth it. After a while, Jason helped Paul back to the edge, lifting him onto the rock. They sat there for a moment, catching their breath, the waterfall thundering behind them. Paul looked at Jason, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Jason. I don't think I could ever repay you for this." Jason shook his head, smiling. "You don't need to. Just keep fighting. Keep doing things that make you feel alive." Paul nodded, his eyes glistening. "I will." Jason helped Paul back into his wheelchair, and they began the journey back down the trail. The sun was starting to set, the sky turning a soft orange. Jason could feel the exhaustion settling in, but there was a lightness in his chest, a sense of peace that hadn't been there before. As they reached the bottom, Paul looked at Jason, his smile still there. "You're a good man, Jason. Don't ever forget that." Jason nodded, his throat tight. He watched as Paul wheeled away, disappearing into the evening shadows. Jason stood there for a moment, looking up at the trail, the waterfall still faintly visible in the distance. He turned and started walking back to the bus stop, his body aching, his heart full. Today had been hard, but it had been worth it. It wasn't about escaping anymore. It was about making these moments count, for himself and for others. Jason returned home as the last of the evening light began to fade, his body aching and his mind swimming with exhaustion. He slowly opened the door to the apartment, doing his best to avoid making noise, but the creaking hinge betrayed him, and he heard his father shuffle from the other room. "Jason, that you?" His father's voice came out, raspy with fatigue. "Yeah, Dad, it's me," Jason called back softly, stepping into the kitchen. He saw his father standing there, already in his worn pajamas, looking tired but relieved. "You were out late again. Everything okay?" his father asked, his brow furrowed in concern. Jason nodded, giving his father a small smile. "Yeah, everything's all right. Just helping someone out." His father looked at him for a long moment, studying his face. Jason could see the worry in his eyes, the way he always looked like he was trying to read Jason's thoughts. But tonight, something was different. The concern in his father's eyes was mixed with something else. Hope. Jason shrugged off his backpack and sat at the table, his father joining him a moment later. They shared a quiet meal, leftover bread, a few slices of cheese, whatever they had in the pantry. It wasn't much, but it was enough. After they finished eating, his father cleared his throat. "You know, I've been thinking. I want to help more. I can't just sit here waiting for things to get better. I need to do something." He paused, looking at Jason carefully. "I know it's been hard for both of us, but I got a lead today. Maybe something might come up soon." Jason frowned, surprised. "A lead? For a job?" His father nodded. "Yeah, it's just a chance, but I met a guy today. He said he might know someone who's hiring. I'm supposed to meet him tomorrow." Jason could see the determination in his father's eyes, the hint of hope that hadn't been there in a long time. It made Jason's chest tighten, a mix of emotions swirling inside him. Pride, worry, hope. "That's great, Dad," Jason said, his voice soft. "I really hope it works out." His father smiled, a real smile that Jason hadn't seen in a while. He reached across the table, giving Jason's hand a squeeze. "We're going to make it through this, son. One way or another. We'll get there." Jason nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He wanted to believe it, and tonight, For the first time in a long time, he did. The next morning, Jason woke up to the smell of something cooking in the kitchen. He blinked, rubbing his eyes, confused. He sat up, listening. His father never cooked, not anymore, not since everything had gotten so difficult. Jason got out of bed, heading towards the kitchen, and saw his father standing by the stove, frying some eggs. "Morning, son," his father said, turning to smile at him. "Thought I'd make us a proper breakfast for a change. Got a big day today." Jason smiled, leaning against the doorway. "Looks good, Dad." They ate together, the warmth of the food filling Jason in a way that had nothing to do with just his stomach. It felt like a small step forward, like something had shifted, something had started to change. After breakfast, his father left to meet with the man who had given him the lead. Jason watched from the window as his father walked down the street, his shoulders a little straighter, his step a little more determined. Jason decided to head out on his own as well. He had a few deliveries lined up, and even though his body still felt sore from the last 2 days, he needed to keep working. There was still rent to pay, bills to cover. But there was a new sense of lightness in his steps as he got on his bike and started pedaling. He spent the next few hours weaving through traffic, moving from one delivery to the next. He recognized the familiar sense of exhaustion settling in, the weight of each hour spent on the bike. But this time it didn't feel as crushing. He kept thinking back to Paul, to the smile on his face when he'd finally touched the waterfall, to his father's hope this morning. It gave Jason the energy to keep going. As the afternoon turned into evening, Jason finally finished his last delivery and decided to head home. The sun was starting to dip below the skyline, the sky turning a soft orange. Jason was almost home when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He stopped his bike by the side of the road, pulling out his phone. It was an unknown number again. Jason frowned, answering. "Hello?" "Jason, it's Paul." Jason's eyebrows lifted in surprise. "Paul, hey, what's going on?" Paul's voice was excited, almost breathless. "I've got some news. You remember my brother, the one I told you about yesterday? Well, I talked to him and he's got a job opening. I told him all about your dad. He wants to meet him." Jason's heart skipped a beat. "Wait, are you serious?" "Dead serious," Paul said, his voice filled with excitement. "He runs a small repair shop. Nothing big, but it's steady work. He said he'd be happy to meet your dad." Jason felt a rush of emotions, hope, disbelief, gratitude. He swallowed, his voice coming out thick. "Paul, I don't even know what to say. Thank you, really." "You don't need to thank me, Jason," Paul said, his voice softening. "You were there for me. This is the least I can do." Jason took a deep breath, a smile spreading across his face. I'll tell my dad. I know this means a lot." "Good. Let's set it up for tomorrow then," Paul suggested. Yeah, absolutely," Jason said, nodding even though Paul couldn't see him. They said their goodbyes, and Jason pocketed his phone, taking a moment to catch his breath. It felt like everything was starting to shift, like all the hard work, the struggle. It was finally starting to pay off. Jason got back on his bike, his heart light, and rode home. When Jason got back, the apartment was dark, his father still not back yet. Jason set his bike against the wall and paced around the small kitchen, waiting, his heart racing. After what felt like forever, he finally heard the sound of footsteps outside the door, followed by the soft click of the lock. His father walked in, his face tired but with a small smile playing on his lips. He looked up at Jason, who was practically vibrating with excitement. "Dad, you're not going to believe this," Jason said, his voice rushing. "Paul, remember the guy I helped yesterday? He talked to his brother and he might have a job for you. A real job at his shop. He wants to meet you tomorrow." Jason's father blinked, stunned. He opened his mouth, then closed it, his eyes wide. Wait, a job? For me? Jason nodded, his heart pounding. Yeah, a repair shop. He said it's steady work. He wants to meet you. His father stood there for a moment, speechless. Jason could see the emotions flashing across his face. Disbelief, hope, fear. Finally, his father let out a shaky breath, his eyes glistening. Jason, I don't even know what to say. Jason stepped forward, wrapping his arms around his father in a tight hug. You don't have to say anything, Dad. We're gonna make it. I know we are. His father hugged him back, his voice cracking as he whispered, Thank you, son, for everything. They stayed like that for a moment, the weight of everything they'd been through together hanging between them. It wasn't gone, not yet, but for the first time in a long time it felt like they were moving forward, like they were going to be okay. Later that night, Jason lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, a small smile on his lips. He thought of Paul, of his father, of all the struggles they'd faced. It wasn't over yet, but for the first time, he felt like they had a real chance. Maybe kindness wasn't just about helping others. Maybe it was about creating opportunities. For himself, for his father, for Paul. And maybe, just maybe, things were finally starting to change for the better. The next morning, Jason was up before dawn, the anticipation of what lay ahead keeping him from getting any more sleep. He sat in the small kitchen, sipping a mug of hot water, his mind running through everything that might happen today. The chance for his father to get a job. It felt like a lifeline, something solid that could help them climb out of the hole they'd been in for so long. His father came into the kitchen, dressed in his best clothes, a shirt and a pair of slacks that were a little too worn, but the nicest things he owned. Jason could see the anxiety on his father's face, the way his hands trembled slightly as he buttoned his shirt. Morning, Dad, Jason said, trying to keep his voice calm. You ready? His father nodded, giving Jason a small smile. I think so. Just nervous, I guess. Jason stood up, moving towards his father. He rested a hand on his shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. You've got this. Paul wouldn't have set this up if he didn't think you were the right person for the job. His father nodded, his eyes glistening with emotion. I know. It's been a long time since anyone gave me a chance. Jason swallowed, his throat tight. He could feel the weight of his father's words, the years of rejection, of struggling to find work, of being told he wasn't good enough. He wished he could take that pain away, but he knew all he could do was be there, to support his father now. Today's different, Jason said, his voice steady. Today you're going to show them what you're made of. His father smiled, a real smile, and nodded. All right, son. Let's do this. They left the apartment together, the morning air cool against their faces. Jason walked his father to the bus stop, the silence between them filled with hope. When the bus arrived, Jason gave his father a hug, holding on tight for a moment. Good luck, Dad, he said, his voice thick. Thanks, Jason, his father replied, his voice barely a whisper. I'll make you proud. Jason watched as his father climbed onto the bus, the doors closing behind him. He stood there for a moment, watching the bus drive away, a sense of both hope and fear settling in his chest. He wanted this so badly, for his father, for himself, for both of them. After the bus disappeared around the corner, Jason turned and headed back home. He had deliveries to make, but today, it felt different. Today, he had hope that maybe, just maybe, they were finally turning a corner. He got on his bike and started pedaling, moving through the familiar streets, the weight of the delivery box on his back almost comforting. He stopped at each address, handing over packages, collecting tips, moving quickly from one place to the next. The physical exhaustion was still there, but today it didn't feel as heavy. Today it felt like progress. As the day went on, Jason found himself thinking about Paul and how much their encounter had changed things. He thought about how close he'd come to just walking away that day, to ignoring Paul's struggle and focusing on his own escape. He was glad he hadn't. Helping Paul had opened a door, one that led to a possibility Jason hadn't even dared to hope for. In the late afternoon, Jason decided to take a short break. He stopped at a small park, sitting down on a bench and taking out a sandwich from his bag. It wasn't much, just bread and a thin layer of peanut butter, but today it tasted better than it had in a long time. He looked around at the people in the park, families, kids playing, people jogging. He wondered if they knew how lucky they were to not have to think about where the next meal was coming from, how to pay the rent, how to keep the lights on. Jason's phone buzzed, breaking into his thoughts. He pulled it out, seeing his father's name on the screen. His heart skipped a beat and he quickly answered. "Dad?" Jason said, his voice full of hope and anxiety. "Jason!" His father's voice came through the line, and Jason could hear the excitement there, the happiness. "I got the job, son. I got it." Jason felt his chest swell, a smile breaking out on his face. He stood up from the bench, his heart pounding. "You got it? Dad, that's amazing." His father laughed, the sound full of emotion. "They said they liked my experience. I start tomorrow. It's not much, just part-time for now, but it's something, Jason. It's a start." Jason felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, and he quickly wiped them away, not wanting anyone in the park to see. "Dad, I'm so proud of you. I knew you could do it. Thank you, son, for everything. I couldn't have done this without you," his father said, his voice thick. Jason shook his head, smiling through the tears. "We did this together, Dad. You and me. We're going to be okay." They said their goodbyes, and Jason hung up, slipping his phone back into his pocket. He took a deep breath, looking around at the park, the sun beginning to dip towards the horizon. For the first time in a long time, Jason felt like he could breathe, like the weight of everything wasn't crushing him anymore. He finished his sandwich and got back on his bike, feeling lighter than he had in years. He made his last few deliveries, each one feeling like a small victory, a step towards something better. He had hope now, real hope, not just wishful thinking. When Jason got home that evening, his father was already there, sitting at the kitchen table with a big smile on his face. Jason walked in, dropping his bag by the door, and his father stood up, pulling him into a tight hug. "We did it, Jason," his father said, his voice trembling. "We're finally moving forward." Jason hugged him back, his throat tight. "Yeah, Dad, we're going to be okay." They sat down at the table together, sharing a meal, a real meal, not just bread and peanut butter. His father had picked up a few things on his way home, some eggs, some vegetables. It wasn't much, but it felt like a feast. They laughed, they talked, they allowed themselves to dream about the future, a future that suddenly seemed a lot brighter. Over the next few days, things started to change. His father went to work at the repair shop, coming home each day with stories about what he'd fixed, the people he'd met. Jason could see the light in his father's eyes, the pride that hadn't been there before. He was working fewer hours now, cutting back on his deliveries, but they had enough to make it work. They were paying the rent on time, keeping the lights on, and even had a little left over for a proper dinner each night. One evening, Jason and his father sat together on their small porch, looking out at the neighborhood. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over everything, and there was a peacefulness in the air that Jason hadn't felt in a long time. "You know," his father said, breaking the silence, "we should take a trip sometime. Maybe go see those waterfalls you love so much. Cachoeiras Azuis, right?" Jason looked at his father, surprised, then smiled. "Yeah, I'd love that." His father nodded, his eyes far away. "We deserve it. You deserve it, Jason. You've worked so hard for so long. We both have." Jason felt a warmth in his chest, a sense of hope for the future. "We'll make it happen, Dad. One step at a time." They sat there in silence for a while, watching as the sky turned from orange to a deep blue, the first stars appearing above them. Jason knew they still had a long way to go, still had challenges ahead, but for the first time, he felt like they had a real chance. They had each other, they had hope, and that was enough. Jason looked down at his hands, the calluses from his years of deliveries, and he thought about Paul, about the waterfalls, about how far they'd come. Maybe life wasn't about escaping the hard times. It was about finding moments like this, moments that made everything worth it. And as he looked over at his father, smiling, hopeful, Jason knew that they were going to be okay. They were finally starting to live, not just survive. Jason woke up to the sound of birds outside his window, the sun streaming in through the thin curtains. It was a Saturday, his one day off from deliveries now that his father had a steady job. Jason sat up, stretching his arms over his head, and let out a long sigh of contentment. Things felt different now, lighter, more hopeful. There were still bills to pay and long hours to work, but the constant, crushing fear of losing everything had finally begun to fade. He got dressed and stepped into the kitchen, where he found his father sitting at the table, reading a newspaper. Jason smiled at the sight. His father looked more relaxed, happier. He had a steady routine now, a reason to get up every morning, and it showed in the way he carried himself. The worry lines on his forehead had softened, replaced by a quiet determination. "Morning, Dad," Jason said, moving towards the stove to make some coffee. "Morning, son," his father replied, looking up from the newspaper. He smiled, setting the paper down. "You sleep all right?" "Yeah, better than I have in a while," Jason said, pouring water into the kettle. "You've got plans today?" His father shrugged, leaning back in his chair. "I was thinking we could spend some time together. Maybe take a walk, get out of the apartment for a bit." Jason nodded, smiling. "Yeah, that sounds good." He paused, glancing at his father. "Maybe we could talk about that trip we mentioned, to the Cachoeiras Azuis." His father's eyes lit up, and he nodded eagerly. "I'd love that. I think we should make it happen, Jason. We both deserve it." Jason felt a warmth in his chest, a smile spreading across his face. "Yeah, we do." After breakfast, they set out for a walk around the neighborhood. The day was bright and sunny, a perfect day for just being outside. Jason and his father walked slowly, taking their time, stopping to talk to a few neighbors along the way. It was a small thing, but Jason felt a sense of pride in being part of this community, these streets, these people, this life they had built. As they walked, Jason noticed his father glancing at him occasionally, a thoughtful look on his face. Eventually, his father spoke up, his voice soft. "You know, Jason, I've been thinking a lot about what you did for Paul, the way you helped him. It wasn't just about getting to the waterfall, was it?" Jason looked at his father, surprised. He hadn't expected this. "I don't know, Dad. I mean, I wanted to help. He needed someone, and I was there." His father nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "But it's more than that. You gave him hope. You showed him that he could still do things, still live his life. And son, I think you did the same for me." Jason felt his throat tighten, the words catching in his chest. He looked down at the pavement, swallowing hard. "Dad, I was just trying to do my best. For both of us." His father stopped walking, turning to face Jason, his eyes filled with emotion. "And you did, Jason. You did more than that. You've carried so much on your shoulders for so long, and I know I haven't made it easy for you. But you never gave up. You kept going, even when it felt impossible. And because of that, we're still here. We're still fighting." Jason looked up at his father, seeing the tears in his eyes, and he felt his own tears start to well up. He nodded, his voice barely a whisper. I wanted us to be okay. I wanted us to have a chance." His father reached out, pulling Jason into a hug, holding him tightly. "And now we do, son. Thanks to you." They stood there for a moment, the busy neighborhood street around them fading away. It was just them, father and son, holding on to each other, knowing that they had made it through the worst of it, and that they had each other to lean on. Eventually, they pulled away, and Jason wiped his eyes, smiling at his father. "So, about that trip?" His father chuckled, nodding. "Let's do it. We'll save up for a few weeks and then we'll go. Just the two of us. We'll see the Cachoeiras Azuis together." Jason grinned, feeling a sense of excitement bubbling up inside him. It wasn't just about seeing the waterfalls. It was about doing something for themselves. Something that wasn't just about survival. It was about living. The following weeks passed quickly. Jason continued with his deliveries, but he was working fewer hours now, taking more time to rest, to enjoy the little moments with his father. His father was doing well at the repair shop, bringing home a steady paycheck, contributing to the bills, and even putting some money aside for their trip. For the first time in a long time, it felt like they were moving forward, not just surviving, but thriving. Jason also kept in touch with Paul. They spoke on the phone now and then, Paul updating him on how things were going at the shop, asking about Jason and his father. Paul was still doing his best, still pushing himself to live his life fully, and Jason found comfort in knowing that he had played a small part in that. Finally, the day of the trip arrived. Jason and his father packed a small bag, some sandwiches, a couple of water bottles, and a change of clothes. They boarded the bus, both of them grinning with excitement. The bus ride to the Cachoeiras Azuis was long, but neither of them minded. They sat together, looking out the window, talking about the future, about their plans, about everything they wanted to do. When they finally arrived at the trailhead, Jason felt a rush of emotions: excitement, nostalgia, a sense of fulfillment. This was the place where everything had started to change for him, where he had met Paul, where he had made the decision to help someone else, even when he didn't have much to give. They started up the trail, moving slowly, taking their time. Jason's father was in awe of the beauty around them: the tall trees, the sound of birds, the distant roar of the waterfall. Jason led the way, pointing out the places where he had struggled with Paul's wheelchair, telling his father the story of their climb. As they reached the final stretch, the roar of the waterfall grew louder, and Jason felt a sense of pride swelling in his chest. He turned to his father, smiling. "Almost there, Dad. You ready?" His father nodded, his eyes wide with wonder. "I'm ready." They rounded the last bend, and there it was, the Cachoeiras Azuis, the water cascading down into the clear pool below, the mist rising up, catching the sunlight. Jason watched as his father's face lit up, his eyes filled with amazement. "Wow," his father whispered, his voice full of emotion. "It's even more beautiful than I imagined." Jason smiled, feeling tears prick at the corners of his eyes. They stood there for a moment, just taking it all in: the sound of the water, the cool mist on their faces, the beauty of the place they had dreamed about for so long. Jason looked over at his father, his heart full. "We made it, Dad. We really made it." His father turned to him, his eyes glistening. "Yeah, we did. And we're going to keep making it, one step at a time." They moved closer to the edge, sitting down on a flat rock by the water. Jason took off his shoes, dipping his feet into the cool water, his father doing the same. They sat there together, the rush of the waterfall behind them, the warmth of the sun on their faces. For the first time in a long time, Jason felt at peace. He looked at his father, at the smile on his face, and he knew that everything they had been through, all the struggles, all the pain, had led them to this moment. A moment of pure happiness, of hope for the future. And as they sat there, the mist from the waterfall cooling their skin, Jason knew that they were finally free. Free to dream, free to live, free to build a new life, one step at a time.